Hey CCPS, this is Jeff Lawson. Today is Monday, September 14th, and I'd just like to take some time to speak about a couple issues. This message in particular is geared and directed towards specifically our employees, our support people, our teachers, our administrators, and everyone. Um, Listen, the last 6 months have been crazy. The coronavirus has given us challenges of the likes I've never really thought we'd have to address. I couldn't be more appreciative for the work that you all have done in your different roles. I spent the last couple days getting out to a number of schools with board members just to see the hard work that's being done on behalf of our students. So I'm super appreciative and thank you for everything you're doing. You know, in the background, we're also struggling with an unprecedented budget crisis. You're seeing it now in positions being reduced. We're hoping that we don't have to reduce anymore, but I certainly can't guarantee that we're not going to feel more effects of a negative budget situation that we're dealing with right now. But the real reason for this message right now is the issue that's really driving a lot of the conversation in the community and society in general, and that is the issue of race, racism. The term institutional racism gets thrown around quite a bit, and I really want to try to put a context for how we are processing this issue, what we see the issue meaning for us as public educators, and a path forward. You may have heard at the last board meeting, I spoke to this issue just for a few minutes, but when I hear the term institutional racism, for me, it has different meanings. It could be racism as it relates to healthcare, to the criminal justice system, in our case, public education. But I think it's hard for us as public educators to not sometimes get defensive when we hear this term institutional racism. So what we did at the Ed Leadership Conference, and the Education Leadership Conference was held last August, and it is all the administrators in the school system, as well as the lead secretaries and the lead custodians. We really tried to tackle this issue head on. We had a panel of African American leaders in the community, really to go through for a good solid hour and a half and just share their story, share their journey, their perspective. And these are accomplished people in our community. Reverend Pastor Brown from the AME Church next door, Shirley Hicks, who is part of the NAACP. She's a former administrator in Anne Arundel County. Dr. Malik Muhammad, many of you know, he was the facilitator. Charlie Givens, old Charlie Givens. Charlie was an assistant principal and a longtime employee for the school system. So we had really some very strong people who had a context for what racism has meant in their life, in their professional, and their own personal journey. And I think it was a great opportunity for us to start to get our arms around of what this will look like. So after the panel, the different school teams broke out and kind of tried to define and plan what this effort will look like for each school moving forward. So as employees, we should all expect to hear this conversation continue, frankly, for the next several years. And I think when it comes to race as a larger issue, it's a very personal issue. We each have our own story to tell about race. Myself, I have very close personal friends that I grew up with from the age of 7, 8 years old that are African American. My view on race and race relationships was very much shaped by these two fellows, two guys who are, to this day, two of my very best friends. And so we all have very personal journeys that lead us to where we are on the issue of race. And I think sometimes as a school system, public educators in general, we will conflate the issue of race with poverty and say to ourselves, well, if we deal with all students from poverty, well then we're going to support our students of other races, our black and brown students. The challenge with that is I think sometimes that's too convenient of a fallback for us as public educators. There are real issues of race for our black and brown colleagues, peers, and community members that go outside the scope of sheer poverty. Many families and children are raised in poverty and find themselves coming out of poverty. And subsequently, they don't have a lot of the pressures that come with families living in poverty. But students and children who are black and brown that is something that they will deal with in our society for the rest of their lives, regardless of how well they do academically and socially. So it's important that we keep a conversation focused on the experiences of our black and brown families and children for the coming years. And I think the best way to look at this is when we look at certain data points in our school system. Things like a child of color is more than twice as likely to be suspended as their white peer. In a school system that has about 11% African American students, only 4% of our gifted and talented students in middle school are students of color. And these kinds of markers are pervasive throughout. You can look something as simple as the DIBELS oral reading fluency, whereas a student of color, only 30% of those students will attain mastery on DIBELS, while their white counterparts, 50%. And so when we look at issues of institutional racism, I define that in my mind as, are there institutions that fundamentally have poorer outcomes for children of color? And the fact that we do doesn't mean the institution is racist. It means that we have structures set in place that are not serving our students of color as well as they might our children who are white. And so really, I think for me, an effective, healthy school system, public education institution, our next step is, what are we going to do about that? And with that, you have my word that the conversation will continue. We will continue to focus on strategies and interventions at a very early age, which will do nothing but help our students of color. And that I think that we would all agree that continuing along this path is simply not acceptable. It's very common, I think, because of the nature of our community, the demographics of many of our schools, is there simply isn't a considerable footprint in terms of students of color in certain schools. We'll have some of our schools where 40–50% of the students are maybe Hispanic, biracial, African American, and other schools where literally there may not be any students of color. We cannot use that as a reason to not address this issue head on. For too long in my lifetime, this is 37 years in public education for me, we have skirted this issue too many times in my experiences. I'm not casting judgments on the values and experiences of others. I'm speaking for myself on this. But I think as a public education system, as a public education industry, it's important that we keep this at the fore. Moving forward, you can expect to have multiple conversations with your school leadership teams, your program leaders, your principals on exactly what we can do as a community to make this better and the safest place to learn for all of our students. Thanks, and have a great week.